So, wir würden gerne weitermachen. Und ich überreiche das Mikrofon jetzt an den Joscha.
Yeah, I'd like to get started. Now we're going to hear from David Brown from the United States, and he's going to talk about posture.
Thank you, Joscha. And thank you, Claudia. Good afternoon, everybody. In England, we call this the graveyard slot. It's when the audience has the most difficulty sitting still and staying awake and listening and thinking. So it will be a small challenge for me and a big challenge for you. And I hope I can make this interesting enough for you to stay awake for the next 90 minutes. I will be watching you very carefully. And if it's not working, I will probably get louder and more exciting. I will try. It's wonderful for me to be back in Oberwesel at a German conference. This is my 5th conference, and many of you, I see familiar faces in the room, people that I know. I always like to begin by explaining a little bit about what I'm going to be saying and telling you a little bit about CHARGE syndrome. And I know you are very familiar, maybe too familiar with CHARGE syndrome, but I think it's always important to remind people of the complications and the problems of CHARGE before I start to talk about any other topic. And my topic, of course, is posture and movement for people with CHARGE syndrome. I'm going to be focused very much on the things that children do. I believe very much that if we want to assess and teach children, the first thing we have to do is to observe them to see what they do. Not what we can do with them, not what they can do if I go and teach them things, but what they do when they are all by themselves just doing the things that they do. And most of what I will be telling you this afternoon comes from my observation of the things children do, completely spontaneously by themselves, and the reasons why they do these things. I like to see what children do because I want to know what the children need. And if the children don't need something, they don't do it because they're not stupid. So if they're doing it, they obviously need it. And my job is to observe this and then to analyze what does the child get from this behavior. If they take a certain posture or they move in a certain way, they must be getting something from that which they need, which their brain needs and their body needs. And that then gives me ideas as the teacher, what kinds of things can I give them to help them like me and want to be with me so that we can together, we can move forwards in our teaching. I'm going to talk a little bit about gravity, the sense of gravity, which for everybody with CHARGE is a big problem. All babies have a problem with gravity, as you know. When we are born, we can't sit, we can't stand, we can't walk. It takes us quite a long time. When you have CHARGE syndrome, for many reasons, gravity is a much bigger problem. And in many cases, the things that children do are a result of their difficulties with the sense of gravity and their attempts to overcome gravity and to get upright and to get moving. Children with CHARGE self-stimulate a lot. And in my job, I go to schools and homes. I go to see a specific child with charge, and the family, or especially the teachers, say to me, how can we stop this child doing the self-stimulation? How do we stop them rocking? How do we stop them flapping their hands? How do we stop them rubbing their head? How do we stop them grinding the teeth? There's always a big interest in how can we stop children doing things, but there's never much interest in why the children are doing these things. And I think first we need to know why they're doing these things before we start to think, how can we stop this behavior? Because if we're stopping the behavior, we have to have something else to give the child. Otherwise, we stop that behavior and they will move on to another behavior, which might be more of a problem. I hope at the end of my talk, I will have helped you to look at the children more carefully, to look maybe in a different way and to look at different things and to think in a different way about what you observe in the children. That's my goal. Though, as you just had lunch, it might be very difficult for you to make that transition. At the moment, so much of your body's attention and energy is going to your stomach, of course, which is very important. We want that. But it leaves less available for your thinking and listening. And so I've put in a lot of photographs because I think it's easier to look at photographs than to look at words. You can tell me afterwards if that was true. I think the self-stimulation behaviors we see in children are their way of coping with life, their way of coping with the world, and their way of overcoming the problems that they face because of having charge syndrome. So that will be what I'm aiming to do. But before I talk specifically about posture and movement, I will go back and I will remind you of things about charge syndrome. And as I said, in a way, you don't need me to remind you, but I think it's helpful to go right back to the basics of charge, especially the sensory issues in charge, because they determine everything that we see in the children. And you know that for most people with charge syndrome, this is their first experience of the world. This is the way they first meet the world. This is the way they first meet other people. This is the way they are first expected to form relationships and to develop some kind of communication system with other people. Here's another picture, an even more shocking picture, I think. But the important thing to say about charge is, even with these terrible beginnings, not just for a few weeks or even a few months, but maybe for a couple of years, in spite of this, the children develop in remarkable ways. We've seen that this morning in the group session. We're seeing it now, well, you're hearing it now from the side of the room. And we all know that we're told these children will never sit, they will never eat, they will never walk, they will never talk. And it usually isn't true. This little girl, within 2 years of this photograph, became this little girl. And yes, she has problems with her development and her learning, but she's a remarkably normal little girl in spite of that terrible beginning. And I'm sure you know that the name CHARGE came from a group of doctors, geneticists, in 1981, who thought that CHARGE syndrome had 6 major problems. And they took the problems, they took the initial letter of the 6 problems in English, and then they moved them around to make the word charge. And I won't say anything about this, but I'm sure you should all be very familiar with this. Unfortunately, what we've discovered since 1981 is that there are many more of these problems. And in 2010, I counted 40 of them, and then I stopped counting. There are problems like the gene mutation, which Dr. Connie's team discovered in the Netherlands, facial paralysis, a whole range of cranial nerve problems. I'll say more about that in a moment. And then there are problems that are more, I think, more specific to what I'm saying today. Problems with the vestibular system and with the semicircular canals in particular. The vestibular system is based in the inner ears on both sides of the head, and it's a very, very important sensory system. So I will say more about it in a moment. But we think that almost everybody with CHARGE syndrome has damage to the vestibular system, which creates many of the difficulties that we see in the children, even when they are teenagers and adults. Not only problems with balance and with walking, but problems with other things like behavior and self-regulation. The ability to keep calm, but to be awake. The ability not to go crazy or not to just fall asleep in the middle of the room. A good vestibular system helps us to develop those things. If the vestibular system is damaged, all those things are going to be difficult to achieve. There's a whole range of dental problems associated with CHARGE. And when we hear about disturbed behavior in CHARGE, one of the first things we think about is pain. There are many reasons why children with CHARGE might be feeling pain. One of the most significant is problems with the teeth. The teeth have poor quality enamel, so they are very prone to decay, even with good dental care. If you look after your child's teeth and clean them regularly, they are still more likely to develop dental decay than your other children will do. So the pain might be from infection or decay, but a bigger problem is that in many of these children, the teeth are not aligned properly. So when they grow, instead of growing up next to each other, they grow into each other. And after a while, the pressure becomes so big that the pain is impossible to bear. And the answer in those situations is for the dentist to actually remove the tooth. So good dental care with a good dentist is really important for everyone, but especially for children with CHARGE. There are problems with the sense of smell. There are problems with the larynx and the pharynx. I mentioned the cranial nerves. We have 12 pairs of cranial nerves which control all of our functioning. And the main ones affected in CHARGE are these. And I've listed the number of the nerve and the sensory system which the nerve controls. And you see that nerve 2 controls our vision. And the damage to that nerve is why so many people with CHARGE have visual problems. Nerve 7 is the one that, if it's damaged, creates facial palsy and also clefting of the face. Nerve 8 is especially important because it controls the hearing, but it also controls that vestibular sense in the inner ears. And we think this is an old guess that says 80%. Oh, sorry, it says 90%. No, 80%. We now think it should say about 95%. Almost everybody with charge seems to have significant problems with the vestibular sense and with hearing, even more with the vestibular problems. And then, the last two, nerves 9 and 10 together, are important for developing good swallowing, feeding and swallowing. And because those nerves are damaged, the child is unable to coordinate breathing and swallowing at the same time. So when they swallow, they aspirate the food onto the lungs and they get serious infections and pneumonia. So many of these children are fed through a gastrostomy tube, and I'm sure that is the case with many of you here. And then there are other anomalies. I won't go into these too much. But I think the problems with the skeleton, the third one down, are in some cases quite significant. Sometimes they are very small problems. The child might have a finger where these joints don't bend because the bones here are joined together, so the joint can't move. But sometimes the problems with the skeleton are much more significant, and the children are born with very severe deformation of a leg or a hand. And in some cases, the leg or the hand might be removed by the doctors because it's not possible to do surgery to improve the problem. There is also a problem with the skeleton because the bones don't grow properly, partly because of a problem with growth hormone. And we have Dr. Jeremy Kirk here at this conference, who will be presenting later this afternoon, who is an endocrine specialist and will be talking about growth problems. There is also a problem with the skeleton because many people with charge, their body does not absorb calcium from their diet very effectively, what we call hypocalcemia. And if your body is not taking calcium from your diet, it's not building the bones effectively. So you get poor bone growth, and the quality of the bones is often poor. I'm going to skip a few slides, if you will bear with me for a moment. I think I've shown this slide every time I've come to Oberwesel, because it's important to keep reminding people that charge is the most multi-sensory of all the syndromes that we know. It's the only syndrome we know where every single sense is probably damaged in some way. And if you look at this list, this is not even a complete list, but these are the main sensory systems. And people often say we have 5 senses. It's very common for people to say 5. And in school, we teach children, what are the 5 senses? And you draw a photograph of an eye, and you draw a picture of an ear, and all that. Actually, there are more than 5, and there are 2 that are particularly important. Proprioception and the vestibular sense, or here it says in an ohr. We would call it the vestibular sense. And I'm going to say a little bit about them. I call them the forgotten senses because people don't talk about them. They often don't know about them. Proprioception is the sense that tells us where all the parts of our body are. It's the sense that keeps our brain in contact with our body so that we know all the time where our body is. So at the moment, if I tell you to think about your left ankle, you know exactly where your left ankle is. And 2 of you have just moved your left ankle because then you get extra proprioceptive stimulation, so you really know where your ankle is. But you already knew where it was because your proprioceptive sense in the ankle was sending messages to the brain telling you it was there. But you didn't think about it because you don't need to think about it. As long as the information is coming in, you're okay, and you don't need to focus on it. Because I said left ankle, suddenly your brain thinks about it, and then you start to move it because you are consciously aware of it. In people with charge, this sense is not working very well, mainly because their muscle tone is very low. They have very floppy muscles, and they don't like resisting gravity, so they tend to stay down on the floor. They like to be very low and supported. And many of the self-stimulation behaviors we see in children with charge are their attempts to increase the proprioceptive information coming into their brain from their body to help the brain get a better idea where the body is. And I'll show lots of photographs of that. The other forgotten sense is the vestibular sense. And that's a much more complicated one. But as I said, the receptors are based in the inner ear on both sides of the head. And this is the sense that tells us where our head is. It tells us if our head is moving, what direction it's moving, how fast it is moving. And it's really, really important, as I said, for many, many aspects of our functioning. I wrote an article 11 years ago now about if the vestibular sense is damaged, what do you see in the child? What are the typical signs in the child? And most typically, you see the muscle tone is very low, very, very floppy. You see poor head control and poor ability to resist gravity, so the children actually don't like it. If you lift them up and hold them, they often get upset. They start to push back because they want to get back down. They want their body and their head completely supported and safe. They want to know that everything is fixed and they're not going to fall and they're not going to hurt themselves. If you hold them upright, they get very upset. If you put them on their back, they are usually very happy, or they're more happy. Sometimes they're unhappy on their back, but that's for different reasons. You see a major delay in movement. They tend to move very late compared to other babies. And when they do move, you see unusual movement patterns. And I've listed some of them, but I will talk more about these: back scooting, side winding, and the 5-point crawl. There are others, but they are the most typical. We see the W sit, what we call the W sit, where the child goes down on their knees, but instead of the feet being underneath, the feet go out to the side. And it gives the child good stability so they don't fall over, but it's not good for the knees and the hips. So the physiotherapist, immediately when they see the W sit, they go over and they stop the child doing it. And we need to talk about finding a good way to allow this so the child has stability, but we don't allow it all day because then they will damage the knees and have a problem. The children often demonstrate better vision, better hearing, and better hand use when they are flat than when they are upright. And unfortunately, most hospital clinics where they assess children's vision or hearing, they like the children to be sitting up, don't they? It's like an obsession. The mother sits on a chair and the child must sit on the mother's lap, upright. And then if it's vision, they come with things and they do this, you know, and all that. If it's hearing, they come, I have nothing to make a noise. They come and they make a noise behind the child, and the child is supposed to turn. And of course, the child doesn't do that, so they think the child is much more blind or much more deaf. Once the child is on the mother's lap like that, in most cases, all the brain is thinking is, how can I get down off my mother's lap? I need to be safe, I need to be stable, and that usually means getting onto the floor or onto the couch or the table. For many years in London, I evaluated children's vision and hearing while they were on the floor, because that's where they had the best vision and hearing. And I can think of at least 2 clinics in London where I went in and I helped the doctors to understand that if the child had CHARGE syndrome, maybe you should just let them play on the floor, and then you can come with your lights and your colored toys, or you can make your noises while the child is on the floor. It's perfectly okay. And actually, you will get a much better idea of how much the child can see and hear if you do it that way. But there are still many places that don't have any idea of that. So most children with CHARGE, the clinical evidence suggests that they are more blind and more deaf than they really are. It's not unusual to see that at first people thought they were this deaf, and then gradually they're less deaf and less deaf and less deaf. Also, they're often thought to be almost completely blind, and then over time we discover that they can see, sometimes with both eyes, in a much better way. The children develop bilateral coordination very slowly. They have big problems with fatigue. Trying to do things when you have no vestibular sense is very, very challenging and tiring. The children like to lay down in order to feel safe, but they also need to lay down sometimes to have a rest, because they are using up so much more energy than we realize. And most importantly, the vestibular sense is the key sense in developing good self-regulation. In all the deaf-blind field, where I work and where Hannah works, the group with the most serious vestibular problems is the group with CHARGE syndrome. In the deaf-blind field where we work, the group with the biggest problems with self-regulation is the group with CHARGE syndrome. The two things go together absolutely, and it's not surprising, because we know that the vestibular sense is very important to develop this good self-regulation. So children with CHARGE tend to be not very good at controlling their own arousal levels. Oops. The good news is, and you may know this quote, I see I'm quoted on this sign. I was sitting there yesterday and I suddenly saw my name on here, and my brain went into my high school German, and I thought, oh, I remember that quote. This is the good news about children with CHARGE. In spite of all these immense difficulties in almost everything they do, in spite of the high levels of stress with which they have to live, they are a remarkably resilient group. They show great creativity, and they find a way to grow and develop with lots of support, of course, from their families and from the professional team, the good members of the professional team. And that's, I've talked about the problems, but I want to finish on a happier note before I move on. I have a quote from Thomas Edison, the American inventor. The only function of the body is to carry the brain around. It's a nice quote because it reminds us that we are actually our brains. I mean, I am my hands and my legs, but they don't think very much, and they don't feel emotions. They don't get excited. It's my brain that thinks. It's my brain that gets excited. Then my hands show it, but my hands are actually not excited because they don't know there's something to be excited about. It all happens up here in the brain. And this is a big problem in charge because there is not a good connection between the brain and the body. That would be the key point of my talk this afternoon. And I will say more about that in a moment. So we know that movement in charge is difficult. The children tend to move very late. They move in unusual ways. They stand and support their weight quite late. And they walk quite late, sometimes very late. Tim and Nancy Hartshorn always remind people that their son Jacob did not walk until he was 7 years old. There are many reasons why movement is so difficult. There are orthopedic problems, which I already mentioned. So the skeleton might be malformed or not very strong. The muscles might be poor quality. There may be cerebral palsy, so there may be a specific orthopedic disability. And most importantly, the connective tissue that binds the joints may be very poor quality in charge. What that means is, around a joint like my wrist, I have tissue, soft tissue, which holds that joint together. It's strong enough to support the joint, but it's flexible enough to allow me to move the joint in all kinds of directions. In CHARGE syndrome, most people with CHARGE, the soft tissue that covers the joints is not very good quality. So the joint tends to be loose, which is why these children can bend their bodies into extraordinary positions, which we can't do, and often their brothers and sisters can't do it, but they are doing it all the time. And to them it is very easy because the joints have no resistance. It's wonderful, and we wish we could do it, but actually it's a huge problem. It would be nice to do at a party when you want to impress everyone, and you can tie yourself in a big ball. But if you're trying to function in normal life, it's a big difficulty. So all those things create problems for movement. Then there are the sensory problems: blindness, deafness, the vestibular issues, the proprioceptive issues, and the touch problems. They are all damaged. They are probably all not working properly, so they all contribute to problems with movement. Then the children are often on drugs or medication, which tends to make them a little bit sleepy. Usually the drugs are there to calm them down. Sometimes they are on antibiotics, which have the impact of reducing their awareness and their arousal level. So you have medication which slows them down and stops them moving. Some of the children have seizure disorder, and because if you're standing and you have a seizure, you can fall and hurt yourself. They are very resistant to standing, and they like to be down on the floor. There are breathing problems. There are difficulties with feeding. Maybe they don't eat very well. Maybe they don't absorb nutrition from the diet, not just calcium, but other things as well. They have low energy, and often the bones and the muscles don't grow very effectively. Stress can be a problem. Depression, anxiety, especially anxiety about gravity and the power of gravity to make you fall over and hurt yourself, especially hurting the head. Then there are low expectations. People often don't expect the children to move or to stand because they have all these other difficulties. Sometimes the children are overprotected. Sometimes the children are given a crash helmet, which they wear, but in many families, the crash helmet is rejected, either because the child won't wear it or the family doesn't want the child wearing it, and that then contributes to the low expectations that the child will stand up and will move. The child themselves has poor awareness or poor motivation because of their sensory problems. They don't know what's around their body, so they don't have any interest in moving. And they can be very distractible. And altogether, these problems add up to very, very slow movement development. And I think that most children with CHARGE are not in touch with their bodies effectively, or they don't feel their bodies effectively. The more I watch the children, the more I can see that their brains are not connected to their bodies very effectively, because it's our senses which make the connection. Our brain doesn't know anything unless our senses are sending information to the brain. If the senses are not doing that, the brain just sits in your head and doesn't know where it is and where you are and what you're doing and what's around you and who's there. And this is a very common observation when I watch the children, and I'm hoping my photographs will help to make some of these points. I want to move forward, if you'll bear with me. I'm going to go through these slides very quickly. I was going to do it another way, but I'm going to talk. I've got lots of photographs, and I've organized them to show different kinds of posture. And I'm going to start with postures that involve the head, and this is very important. I was in a consultation this morning with a family where the last thing I said was their daughter is doing a lot of bad self-abusive things, especially to the head. It seems to be the center for all these sensory inputs. She's hurting herself and creating pain, but I think it's a pattern of trying to give the brain more information about where the head is because the vestibular system is missing and is not doing it. It's very hard for us to understand vestibular problems because we know where our head is because we have a vestibular system. We know if our head is moving. We know what direction it's moving. I know where my head is, and I know it just moved. Now I know it has stopped. Now I know it's gone back, but it hasn't gone back to the same place. It's gone back to a different position. Of course, my eyes are giving me some of that information, but it's mostly my vestibular system. We can't imagine what it's like when your brain doesn't know where your head is. But if I could give you vestibular problems very quickly while you're sitting there, you would start to develop some of the behaviors you will see in these photographs. You might be a little more careful about them because you're adults and you're socially aware, but after a while you wouldn't even be more careful because your brain would have such a strong need to confirm where your head is. So you get this kind of behavior. I already know at least 2 families here have a child who does this because you laughed when the picture came up. And it wasn't a laugh because the picture is funny, it was a laugh because you recognize this kind of behavior. I have many pictures of children putting things on their head like boxes and buckets and bowls in the kitchen and so on. This is Tim Hartson's son. He's at the swimming pool. He has an inflatable plastic pool for young children, but he's doing it all wrong. Don't people with CHARGE do everything all wrong all the time? And we get annoyed and we say, no, not like that. But they're actually doing it right because he doesn't want this as a pool to put water in and splash with his feet. He wants it this way because then it gives strong pressure on his head because he doesn't feel where his head is very effectively. He then gets into the pool with this on his head, and he bends his legs, and then the pool sits on the water, and he squeezes the air out, and then when he stands up, there is a vacuum on the water, so this plastic thing pushes even harder on his head. And then he just bounces up and down for a long time, getting strong proprioceptive stimulation coming through the head, the neck, and all down the spine, which is giving his brain a much better idea of where his head is and where his trunk is, because otherwise he doesn't know that most of the time. Then there are headstands. Children who can't stand on their legs do this all the time. I don't know about your children, but I have probably 4 dozen photographs of young children who can't stand yet doing this. And sometimes it gets very dramatic. They do it with great confidence. They rarely fall over. And I think the main reason is because they know, we don't know how they know, but they know standing up gives you only 2 points of support, the left foot and the right foot. But if you do this, you have 3 points of support. You have 1 foot, the other foot, and the top of your head. It's a much more stable position. You get all the wonderful sensory input of bearing weight, but without any of the danger of falling over and banging your head. It's a very secure position. Now, to us, first of all, it looks a bit crazy, but even worse, if the child can't stand up, how can they do this? This looks more advanced, it looks more clever, it looks more dangerous. And I'm getting old. To me, this looks much more difficult than standing up. I would much rather stand up. If I did that, I would hurt my back, I would hurt my neck. All the blood would come to my head and I'd get dizzy and I would have to sit down. The children do it because their brain is needing better contact with the body, and they find safe ways, stable ways to give the brain this information. It's very creative, and we have no idea how the children learn this, because most parents don't teach their child to do this. Some of you, maybe you taught them. I think it's unlikely. And then it can get even more advanced. Again, it looks very dangerous, but if you look carefully, you've actually got 5 points of support. You've got 2 arms, 2 feet, and the head. The more points of support you have, the more stable you are, and the less likely to fall over. He's also doing it on the couch, of course, so if he does come over, it won't hurt too much. Then the children get more advanced, and this girl has gone from 5 points of support to 2. And she doesn't just lift the arms, but she does this very, I call it Olympic level headstanding. She can't stand up. That's the thing I want to keep saying to you. She cannot stand up because it's not safe, but she can do this because it is safe. It doesn't look safe to us, but they know it's much safer than standing up. And I'm sure these children have had a good therapist and great parents and brothers and sisters who are constantly working on standing up and moving along the couch. And it will develop. But in the beginning, they go for this because this is a safer idea, but their brain needs this pressure information, so they get it in another way. And here's an extremely advanced version. But again, we have 5 points of support. The head, 2 hands, and 2 feet. And you see how the feet are holding over the top. Nobody teaches this to the children. They never see this. I have no idea how they know these things, how they discover, how that child ever got to the point of learning about this, and then how did they get to the point of doing it? Ask me to do this, and I couldn't do it. I wouldn't even try, it's too dangerous. And if you think, not only is it about points of support, but when you stand, if you fall over, the thing which is the furthest distance from the floor moves the fastest, and it hits the floor the hardest. And in standing, that's going to be your head. In this position, if you fall, it's your feet that will hit the floor hardest. And our feet are not particularly sensitive compared to our head. So there are several reasons why this makes sense if you stop and really think about it, instead of just looking at it and saying, whoa. And all children go through these developments, but children with charge go through them more dramatically and for a much, much longer period. Here's a child who's been asked to pose for a photograph. And the first thing she does is go in a big circle towards the camera and then arches the neck, because in that position, the head is fixed, very fixed. And then she can look at the camera and smile and pose for the photo. But if she comes around in this position, or if you sit her up, she has such poor head control that she can't pose. She knows she needs to pose, and that means keeping still, and that means getting into this position. Then there's a whole range of behaviors associated with the legs. And these are probably the most common in charge. And this is, someone in America calls this the David Brown posture, because it's probably the most common, unusual posture in charge syndrome. How many of you have a child who does this or who used to do this? 1, 2, 3. Yeah. 2/3 of the people in the room put their hand up, which doesn't surprise me. What you've got is a child who's actually too young to know about this position, but who's discovered it. You bring one knee up, and then you bring the other ankle, and you put it on the knee, and you push hard. And through your legs and your hip, your brain then gets very, very strong proprioceptive information to tell the brain where your body is, and to tell your brain that your body is fixed, it's not going to move, it's completely safe, so you can think about other things. You can listen to music, you can watch your mother, or whatever it is you want to do. You can do it if you're giving yourself a drink. But you need to know that your body is fixed and safe. Postural security is what we all need. And the children find this strategy because their proprioceptive sense is not giving them the information unless they exaggerate the sensory input by taking up these postures. Again, this child is much too young to know about this posture. Regular babies of this age don't do this. You don't see it. In charge, you see it from about 6 months. Tiny babies who suddenly bring the knee up and bring the leg up. It's extraordinary how quickly they learn, because their brains have a desperate need to get this pressure information so they know where the body is and that it's safe. I mentioned this on Facebook a couple of months ago, and I got, I think, 60 photographs from all around the world, mostly from mothers, of course, all saying, this is my son, this is my daughter. This is a girl I know going to sleep. How can you go to sleep if you don't know where your body is, and you don't know if it's safe, and you don't know if it's going to fall over, and you're going to hurt yourself? Well, you bring one ankle up on the other knee, and then you just float off to sleep. Here's the same girl 18 months later. She's now taking a nap in the afternoon, and she doesn't just do the legs, but she does this, which again is significant proprioceptive stimulation through the hands and the arms, but especially through the upper arm and the shoulders and the top of the back. Very, very strong pressure information to say, here's your body, it's not moving, and it's absolutely still. So it's okay, you can just go to sleep. Here's another example, much bigger cross legs. Here's somebody in a long, boring car ride, and she wants to drop off to sleep. But first, the ankle must come up. The other reason children do this position is because the vestibular sense is the main sense that helps us to use our vision effectively. We have a reflex which is called the Vestibulo ocular reflex, and I've talked about it in Oberwesel in the past. What that reflex does is this. If I will look at Hannah, because we're old friends, and I haven't seen her for a long time, and she's right in the front. I need vision to see Hannah. So I need vision and good visual acuity. I can find Hannah, but then I can move all around. I can go down, I can come up, and I don't lose her visually. My eyes stay on her. That is not a visual skill. That is a vestibular skill. I need eyes to find Hannah and look at her, but if I don't have a vestibular sense, when I move, my eyes go with my head, and then I have to look for Hannah again. And when I go down, my eyes go down, and I have to look for Hannah. When I come up, I look at the back of the room, and I have to find Hannah. It's my vestibular sense that tells my brain where my head is moving, so I have to move my eyes in the opposite direction. So when I turn to my right, my vestibular sense says to my brain, the eyes are moving to the right, so they need to swing to the left. And the moment my head stops turning, my vestibular sense says to my brain, the head has stopped moving, so the eyes mustn't move anymore. Otherwise, I keep moving to the left, and I'm not looking at Hannah anymore. If the vestibular system is not there, when the head moves, the eyes go with it. They have no choice. They go with it, and you lose the focus. So if you want to use your vision in a controlled way, you have to stop your head from moving, because every movement of your head will pull your eyes away. So when children are using fine vision, like looking at books, you often see this posture. You see it when they're sitting up. And many children discover quite early that the leg on top is also a good place to rest the book. So you're not holding it up. It's much easier for you physically. Here's someone, an older child, who wants to use a handy. I've learned that word in Germany this week, and I will take it back to America. It's much nicer than cell phone, I think. He's got his grandmother's handy, and he wants to read. He wants to scroll the address book and call somebody. He can't do that if he's sitting up. Even though he can walk and run and kick a football, he can't use fine vision when he's sitting up because his body and his head move and his eyes keep being pulled away. So he lays down, he brings the ankle up to fix the body, and then he can use his vision very effectively, even though he is blind in one eye and he only has a small piece of vision in the other eye. It really works well. Here's somebody else showing the leg posture, this time with an iPad. Here's another reader, and another one. This is a girl I worked with a long time ago, demonstrating the behavior. And this is one of my favorite pictures. This is a boy who's gone to the hospital to see the ophthalmologist. We observe children to find out what they're doing, to find out how they are feeling, to interpret those things, and then to respond to them from our interpretation. So what we have to do is look at this and say, first of all, how do we think he's feeling? How do you think he's feeling? Can anyone shout out a word? Comfortable? Uncomfortable. Yes, thank you. uncomfortable, suspicious, scared, unhappy. He's obviously on high alert, and the posture is very distinct and very unusual in this situation. First of all that deep pressure tends to be very calming, so it's a way of calming himself down because he's stressed. But even more important, he's doing this for visual reasons. He has no functional vestibular system, but he wants to know where the doctor is. It's the most important thing in the world at the moment. And you know where the doctor is because he's showing you. The doctor is about here because he's pointing with his eyes. And he's keeping himself still because he doesn't want his eyes to be pulled away, because then he won't see the doctor and the doctor may come and get him. And I'm told it took the doctor about half an hour to come and get him because the child was just moving around the room. And here is, I stayed with Claudia and Heiko a few days ago, and this is her son Jonas, demonstrating very typical posture. Unusual in a child who is 12 years old, unless they have CHARGE syndrome. And he's doing it to fix his body so that he's free to look and listen and turn the pages or operate the iPad without worrying about his posture. What was most interesting to me, towards the end of my visit, he has two younger sisters who don't have CHARGE syndrome. But they have grown up with a brother with CHARGE syndrome, and I couldn't believe what I was observing. I had to go and get my camera. The girls had no idea I was taking their photograph, fortunately. It was one of the great moments of my life when this happened all of a sudden. They will stop doing this very quickly, I think, because they don't have to do it. But Jonas has to do it. He can't function without doing it. It's just a nice example of how these things can be transferred sometimes. Then there are postures involving bending and stretching. This is an old photograph of a boy watching television at one of the American CHARGE conferences. Here's someone else. Here's a baby I met last year in the United States. She was very floppy, very loose, no muscle tone. She was unfortunately asleep. But the parents said sometimes she stretches very hard. And the next day they sent me this photograph, and I was surprised because this little girl had no muscle tone at all in her mother's arms. And this is a behavior she sometimes does for maybe even 20 seconds. It's a major physical achievement. Again, I couldn't do this. Most of you couldn't do this. She does it because there is such a powerful need in her brain to get this information from her body. Here's another one. Here's somebody fixing their vision so that they can look at the book. Again, it looks crazy. It looks as if it doesn't make sense. But if you really think carefully about it, and if you learn about CHARGE syndrome, it does make sense. And while I was at Claudia's house, this was posed. She said that her youngest daughter, Johanna, because Jonas used to watch television like that, she does it sometimes. So we asked her to do it. But all Claudia said was, show David how you watch television. And she got on the couch and did it straight away. Then there are postures related to hanging. This is a brother and sister, and the sister on the right has CHARGE syndrome. She's using the swing in a very typical way. Here's a boy I worked with many years ago, completely blind, completely deaf, floppy muscles, low muscle tone. His mother has taken him to the swing and put his hand on it. He's dropped to the floor. She's walked away, and he brings his hand up and then he climbs into this position. He gets deep pressure on his stomach, but his legs and his upper body are being stretched, which is proprioceptive stimulation. And then he takes one arm out of his shirt and he puts both arms in one sleeve, very, very tight around the arms. They are all attempts to get the brain in better contact with the body so that the brain knows where his body is. This was sent to me a few weeks ago. Parents now send me these pictures and say, is this okay? Or is this crazy? Or should we stop this? The answer is no, you shouldn't stop it unless it's dangerous. This child is not asleep, but it's typical posture on the swing. And this boy's hanging in all sorts of ways, upside down, by the arms, over the belly. Then there are postures involving the hands. This is Tim and Nancy Hartson's son. He's sitting on a small seat without support. There's nothing for his arms to rest on. He's not in a safe position. So he pushes his hands together very hard. The nails turn white, and he's supporting himself. Once he does this, his brain can feel where his body is and that it is stable and fixed and everything is safe. I asked him, what does he do if you take his hands apart? And he slides down onto the floor and he lays on his back on the floor. This is what enables him to remain on the seat and to be fairly relaxed and to be safe. Here's a different posture. Here's a baby having a drink with the fingers crossed. Crossing the fingers is a classic way of telling your brain where your hands are because you don't feel them properly. And when you cross the fingers, you get extra proprioceptive information from the fingers, the hand, the wrist, all the way up through the arm and even the shoulder. If you do it yourself, all these muscles get tighter, and then you know exactly where your body is from the shoulders right down to the fingers. This is a girl who is walking, but if you ask her to stand still and she has nothing to hold on to, she puts the arms out and crosses the fingers. And when you tell her she can walk again, first she walks and then she uncrosses the fingers. It's very noticeable. One hand behind the back is a characteristic position. This child is kneeling to look, and that hand comes down again because then you get pressure information from the shoulder all the way down. Here's the girl with the crossed fingers who also, if you ask her to keep still, can hold her hands very hard in front of her. And here's a boy who does it behind instead of in front. He walks normally, but when he stands still, first he brings the hands together behind the back. He gets amazing information from this part of his body, and then he can stand still. If you make him move his hands to the side, he starts to walk again. And here's a girl who's using her hands to put pressure on her head and then point the fingers to help her know where to look. It's like a very clever adaptation to deal with vestibular problems. Then there's planking. Here's a child who can't stand. It's too dangerous and too difficult. And his mother comes from the kitchen, and this is what she sees. She has no idea how he did that. Where did he learn to do it? She sent me the picture, and I explained why he's doing it. I don't know how he learned it, but I know why he's doing it, because his brain needs information about his body, and he's found a way of doing it that's safe. He's not going to fall here. He knows he's safe. Here's a different version. Here's a girl who wants to fix her vision to play with the iPad, and she's discovered this is a good way to do it. Here's an 8-year-old who comes home from school, very tired, very stressed. She's in a wheelchair all day. She doesn't stand, but she gets herself in this position. And for several minutes, she can sit and she can move her hand and watch it. And you can hear her breathing go from very quick and shallow to more normal rate. She is calming herself down, relaxing, and getting ready for the evening at home with the family. And here's a boy who's fallen asleep. He's planking and fallen asleep. Then there is propping, supporting the head because resisting gravity is difficult, and if the head moves, the eyes move because of the missing vestibular sense. Here's another child. Here's another one supporting her head. Then there's probably my favorite, squeezing. Getting the body into a small space to feel as much pressure as possible. Do you see this in your children, ever? Yeah, at least 4 of you do. 5 of you do. This is a boy I know in Texas. His mother said he's developing. He used to do this under the chair. Now he gets onto the chair, then he arches his back to push the table, and then he brings his head down and relaxes, but his body is really pressed. And when he comes off the chair, if you lift his shirt, you can see the mark on his back, a little red mark where he was pushing against the table. This is another favorite picture of mine. It's a child with charge doing all the wrong things. You're supposed to be on top of the cushion, relaxing. But she has charge syndrome, so it's much better for her to be under the cushion, feeling the pressure. And this is a girl I work with in California. This is her getting organized. And this is her in position. And she will drop there between the couch and the wall. And if someone has moved the couch, she gets back out. She pushes the couch closer to the wall, and then she goes back. She has to be squashed. She needs pressure information to know where her body is. And this is my absolute favorite photo. This is the photo I use when I talk about making a diagnosis of charge syndrome. I see bare feet. The child doesn't like shoes and socks. They're squeezed into a small space, which is really too small for their body, and they have a feeding tube. And you put the 3 things together, and I think, yes, this is probably charge syndrome. I know it's charge syndrome, but I would guess charge. Then there's the W-sit, which I mentioned, which the physiotherapist hates so much, but it does give the child a certain stability. There it is again. And here are a brother and sister watching a DVD, and you see one is sitting in a fairly normal way, the other one has the W-sit, and it's the one with the W-sit, of course, who has charge syndrome and has these vestibular issues. A lot of these postures, as I said, are answering the question, where is my head? And I've got a list of the things that I see, the self-stimulation behaviors involving postures and movement, which are ways of giving the brain an idea of where the head is. Head weaving is where the head does this. Sometimes it's different, sometimes it's like this, but usually it's the figure of 8 to give strong pressure information through the neck and maybe some vestibular information in the head. Binding the head, taking a scarf or some string and winding it very tight around the head. I know a girl who, they had a sweatband. You know, when you're playing tennis, you wear a sweatband around your wrist. And it was for an adult. And one day the mother found that the girl had managed to push this over her. She was wearing it around her head. It was too tight, We don't know how she managed it, but she got it on her head, and she wouldn't let them take it off. It was very important to her. And the mother said she sits much better when she's wearing this, which doesn't surprise me, because with that tight around her head, her brain has much more information about where the head is, so she's better able to keep it steady and not have it moving around and be falling over. Holding the head and tapping the head in various ways, pressing the head, children who stand with the head pushed on the wall and push it against the wall. Children who clench the jaw, who bring the teeth together very, very hard. Children who grind the teeth, which is very typical in charge. And children who like to bite or chew on something all of the time. The jaws give a very large amount of proprioceptive stimulation, very powerful. You've already seen this girl doing this head pressure. In the US now, there are companies who make equipment. This is a kind of scarf that children can wear when they need to bite and chew on things. Otherwise, they often use their clothing. They pull their shirt up and they bite and chew on it. They wear this. And there are companies that, oh, sorry, I haven't shown you the picture yet. There it is. There are also companies that make, it looks like jewelry, but actually it's soft silicone, and it's especially for children to wear if they need to bite and chew on things. There are more and more of these companies now around the United States. The early mobility, we see this whole range of movement, rolling, side-winding, back scooting, bottom shuffling, 5-point crawl, and sometimes the regular crawl. These are all responses to low muscle tone and vestibular issues. Here's a 5-point crawl. So you've got 2 arms, 2 legs, and the head to give extra stability and stop yourself falling. And then walking itself, many of the children use walkers. Here's a child using a walker, which is quite common in charge. They often roll as they walk. It's very, very characteristic. They often use very flat feet. They like the feet bare with no socks and no shoes, and they slap the feet on the floor with a lot of pressure. And then sometimes they go to toe walking. They come up on the toes and they walk in this way, because then the pressure on the feet and the legs increases very dramatically. Again, it's a strategy to help the brain feel the legs to know where they are for safety and stability. And there are other features of walking as well. So here's one child with a walker. Here's somebody else in the supermarket with a walker. And here's a girl in England who had big problems with walking because of balance issues. They gave her some walking poles. I'm sure you have these in Germany. Many people use them when they go hiking, long walks. Her parents report that they have completely changed her life. She's more self-confident, more mobile, more expressive with her language, more sociable, and has more energy. Not least because she's using less energy when she walks, because she's no longer having to work to stay upright. And we've seen these walking poles now work successfully with much younger children, maybe at 6 years or 7 years of age. Climbing. This is a child who can't stand. It doesn't make sense to us because we think we're very sensible people. But this child has CHARGE syndrome. And they've gone to a play group. The mother has seen this wall, taken the child over, and the child has just climbed up the wall. Because they have 4 points of support, and they're enjoying the pressure coming through their body from hanging on these things. Here's an older girl whose walking is very unreliable and not very safe, who's really enjoying herself. And here's a boy I work with. In the middle of the night, the mother hears a noise. He is walking, but again, his walking is not very safe. And he's moved a chair, climbed on the chair, climbed on the cupboard, and he's trying to take apart the light. Then there are postures coming from the facial paralysis. This is a child who can't smile, so he's discovered a way to smile at people. Not taught by anybody. This is a girl who's trying to smile, but she needs a lot more practice. At the moment, she's only doing this. But I met her last year, and she's now doing this, and she has a beautiful smile. And here's a boy who's doing the opposite. He's upset with his mother. He knows what to do because he has 3 brothers, but he can't do it because of the facial paralysis. Now I am going to skip because I'm running out of time. Excuse me if I go through lots of these. So I want to say, because we're almost out of time, why am I talking about these things for a whole afternoon when you're all very tired and very hot, and you've traveled to Oberwesel, and you were hoping to get magic information? Well, I don't have magic information, but I do think we need to observe the children much more carefully than we do. And I especially think professionals need to observe more carefully. And I'm ashamed that teachers are so bad at observing the students. Why do we need to observe and see these behaviors? First of all, to understand the problems and the challenges that the child has. It gives me lots of information about the difficulties they have, because it's because of those difficulties that they do the things I've been showing you in the pictures. So it gives me all sorts of information about what I need to think about. Secondly, it helps me to appreciate their creativity, that what they're doing is actually very clever, and it's totally functional, and it's really good. Because in schools, everyone thinks it's really bad, usually. And that's a big problem, because they don't understand. Then it helps us to be able to introduce the child to other people. We then have information we can give new people to tell them about the child very quickly, so that they can build a relationship and start to understand each other. It reminds us of the really important things which often get ignored and forgotten. We need to think about posture and the connection between the brain and the body, because that is going to control everything else that happens. If you're a teacher and you want the child to be looking and listening, if you want the child to be doing something with their hands while they look, their brain has to be in touch with their body and has to be confident that the body is safe and there's no problem. Because we are organized as human beings, if our brain can't feel our body, and if we don't know that our body is safe, that is what we think about. That is what we pay attention to. And we don't pay attention to the teacher. We don't look at the board. We don't look at the book. We don't listen to what the teacher is saying. We do things to get our body organized and safe. It helps us to remember that everything these children do takes more time, more planning, more energy, more concentration, and more attention than it does for other children. So if we put a child on a chair, like your chair, and ask them to do something with us, we've already given them a huge job by sitting them on the chair. There's nothing for their arms, so they have to deal with that and think about it and organize it even before they start to think about what we're doing. We're playing with a ball, or we're telling a story, or we're drawing a picture, or whatever. So we are all the time giving them extra things to do, but we don't realize it, because for us, sitting on a chair is just very simple. and very easy. But if we can make sure their feet are on the floor, if we can make sure they have armrests that they can put their arms on or even hold on to, if they can have a table in front which they can lean on, all of a sudden their brain is much more available to work with us. And finally, it's important because it reminds us that things that look crazy are actually very good, very creative, and very functional. And in our work with children, I always think about 3 kinds of communication we need to work on. First of all, in every interaction, we need to make sure that the child's brain is communicating with the body effectively. And there are many strategies we can use to help that connection. So before the child has to sit and eat their dinner, or before they sit and do a lesson in school, maybe we need to do some massage to improve the connection of the brain and the body. Maybe we need to hold their hands and do some jumping. Maybe we need to do some pressure inputs, pushing down on the head or on the shoulders, or holding the arms and pushing like this to give strong proprioceptive input. All these things are going to give the brain a much better connection so that when you do the lesson or when you eat the meal, the child is more likely to be concentrating and free to pay attention. So I think when people talk about self-stimulation, they often think of things like grinding the teeth, flapping the hands, sucking the fingers, but I think posture is self-stimulation. I think when you fold your arms, you are providing sensory stimulation for yourself. You are all very tired and very hot. I don't know how many of you can see the time. I can. And I know this is almost finished, but you may not know that, which makes you even more tired. But most interesting for me is how much you are all self-stimulating in order to keep yourself awake, because it's becoming more and more difficult. And there's much more crossing the legs, folding the arms, propping the head, leaning on the knees, leaning on the chair in front, all these, doing this kind of sitting, all these behaviors are telling me that you're finding it more and more difficult to keep your brain connected to your body. And that takes priority. So you have to do something like this, or sitting back and crossing your legs, because that then gets the connection a little more effective for you. So think about posture. And I know that there are self-stimulation behaviors in charge which are dangerous, where the child hurts themselves or they hurt other people. I'm not talking about those, but I think all those behaviors begin like this. There is a need to connect the brain and the body. So the child taps or grinds the teeth or hits himself or pinches himself or shakes himself. And then over time, those behaviors can have a different meaning. But that doesn't mean that the behavior didn't begin as a sensory need. And I think my main object today, this is my dog Alice, and the message is we need to observe the children very carefully. Alice is the best observer I've ever known. She came as a little puppy, and I've never seen anything observe so carefully. Every noise I made, every move I made, she was there. Everywhere I went, she followed. And she's not just observing, but she's saving the information. She's computing it. And then when she was 1 year old, she was like a mind reader. She knew exactly what I was going to do before I even did it, because she recognized the signals. She knows at night when I'm reading, when I'm going to stop reading and take her for a walk, because I turn and I look at the clock. And as soon as I look at the clock, she jumps up and she's all excited. And I'm thinking, oh, well, yes, it's 10 o'clock. How did she know? Well, she knows because she's been observing and seeing the patterns. So there is a need to observe much more closely. And I want to finish, because I'm in Germany, and because this is a very special weekend for Claudia, and because Jonas, it's the second time I've stayed with Claudia's family, and both times Jonas has taught me many things. It's good to be in a child's home for days instead of just for 2 hours for a visit. These are photos Claudia sent me recently. She knew I would love them. She knew I would ask if I could show them today, which I did in about 2 minutes. He's just proving what I've said. He has a need to get his brain in good contact with his body so that he can relax. Now, to us, this doesn't look relaxed, does it? It looks like very hard work. It also looks quite dangerous, because if that was me, I would fall over, I would hurt my back, I especially would hurt my neck. But for him, this is what gives his brain the information it needs so that he can relax and concentrate on what he's doing. It's absolutely classic. And the important thing is that we recognize why this is happening and what it means. We can then work with him, with a therapist maybe, to improve his muscle tone. We can do some exercises before he plays with the iPad. But we need to respect him and say, this is a functional behavior. It's not crazy, it's not stupid, it's not lazy. This is a functional, adaptive behavior that's very creative and very important. And it's this behavior that enables him to do what he's doing. It's not stopping him, it's not getting in the way, it's actually opening the possibilities, but it's also giving me lots of ideas about what he needs in order to help him to develop. So I hope that was helpful for you. I hope it's given you things to think about. I'm here until lunchtime tomorrow if you want to catch me. And you can always email me. I did put my email address up, but it's gone from this slideshow. But you can get it from me if you need it. And I do answer emails, but it takes a long time sometimes. So thank you for listening.
Vielen Dank, David. Thank you, David.
Thank you, David. Okay, there's a coffee break now. It's again back at the bistro and also downstairs, one floor below. And we're then going to continue with Jeremy Kirk at 4 p.m.